in St Patrick's Park, outside St Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin today, because we're going to talk about St Patrick to illustrate a particular theme, and that is, how does mythology and the arts, how do they tell a story in a way that's different to history telling a story? My name is Neasa MacErlean, and I'm the author of a book which covers these subjects, and I have to apologise as I put this up to you, because you can see that my technology has decided to put it in mirror image, but the book's called Telling the Truth is Dangerous. And the reason that telling the truth is dangerous is that excuse me you can take away people's long cherished beliefs if you suddenly say what you believed in the past is wrong, and we're now going to tell you the truth. So much of our value system is tied in with ancient beliefs about ourselves, such as St Patrick, that it can seem very shocking if someone says that's not true anymore. But that's the job of historians. And just to, this is Ireland, and the person here is Robert Dudley Edwards, who's one of the great historians who brought about change in the last century to the academic study of history. And he's also my grandfather, and he's the subject of this book. So, St Patrick. Here in St Patrick's Park, it's a beautiful park actually, and there is a myth that the cathedral was built here because St Patrick baptised the first Christians here in an ancient well, but we're not sure if that's true. It hasn't been found. So St Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, who was he? Was he a mythological figure or was he a historical figure? And which of those two stories would we prefer, and how do we understand them differently? What happened was that in the 1940s there was a vicious academic debate about St Patrick, and it was so ferocious because of what I was saying a minute ago, the investment by the country in this personality of St Patrick and the values he represented. And it also meant, because he came from mythology at that stage, his existence hadn't been proven in a historical sense, it meant that the Catholic Church had ownership of him. They could say to people, we know the details about St Patrick, they came through to us through our faith, and no one can deny those truths. And the danger was for the Catholic Church that once historians got their fingers involved in talking about St Patrick, that they could find something which maybe said that he never existed, or that he did disreputable acts, etc. And that was why there was so much concern about it. But what happened was, after Robert Dudley Edwards, with a colleague, a particular colleague from another university here, started to set up the infrastructure for history. This included conferences and a journal where historians could exchange ideas and build upon their findings once they decided that they were true. So after that happened, there was a forum for people to write articles and discuss whether there was one Patrick, no St Patricks, two St Patricks. That was the theory at one stage, or what happened. And this debate went on for a very long time. You might think, well, it's pretty easy. A fact is a fact. So you can prove that if it's 1 + 1 = 2. It's as simple as that. You can prove St Patrick's existence or not by looking for relics and corroborating evidence. But it's much more complicated than that psychologically. We are, as human beings, much more wired for the mythological and the artistic kind of story, because it's gone back so much longer in our own evolution. 64,000 years ago, people were painting a story about animals on the caves in Spain, and that's one of the farthest back discoveries that we've had. I don't think we've had discoveries going back farther than that, but 64,000 years. By contrast, Herodotus, who's regarded as the father of history, he lived just 2,500 years ago. So we have much more experience in that part of our brain which has a kind of emotional response to a story. And in fact, really, you'd have to say that history is a newcomer to the game, even academically, that actually art and literature are the parents of history. And history is difficult because in history you have to override your emotions in many cases. You have to try to be objective. You have to accept that views and facts which are not to your liking could be true. You have to be able to present your enemy's point of view to the extent that you could actually write something from your enemy's point of view. And that's actually a great skill, because in the end, historians such as Robert Dudley Edwards believed that the point of history was to make us understand each other, and that one of the benefits of that would be we would start to blame each other less and fight each other less. So, was St. Patrick a real figure or not? I'll tell you, he did live. And we found evidence starting from the 40s and going on until fairly recently. It took a good half century to be sure. We found evidence in the form of 2 letters that were written by the same man in Latin in the 5th century. And one's called the Confession, and that's his autobiography, to give it a modern word, and the second was the letter to Coroticus, which is a letter to some Scottish raiders who were coming across from Scotland into Ireland and raiding the communities there. And St. Patrick was trying to persuade them to do less of that. So the Confession tells us more about who St. Patrick was, that he was born in Britain and lived there until he was about 16, at which stage he was captured and taken hostage by some Irish pirates. Sorry, there's a pigeon over there that's looking at me. Anyway, and he was brought to Ireland, where he was enslaved and lived here looking after animals for 6 years, at which point he escaped. So then he went back to his home, but he had liked the Irish, and he also was very motivated by his Christian ideals, and he came back here to spread the word about Christianity. And from a historical point of view, he was really significant, because proving him was marvellous. He was the first individual identifiable figure in Irish history. So what is he? Is he mythological? Or is he, now that the historians have actually proved that he lived, does that mean that he's just historical and not mythological anymore? He is mythological too, because he represents in the myths the values of Ireland. For example, he is said to have banished snakes from Ireland. Now that actually isn't true. The fact was that there were never any snakes in Ireland, but he was said to have banished them because evil was represented by snakes. Some elements of the story and celebrations about him are exaggerated, but they have a kind of symbolic truth. So you have this wonderful development that's happened over in Chicago in the last 60 years, in which the people in the dyeing industry who produce dyes for clothes and so on, they dye the river green on St. Patrick's Day on March the 17th. And although green actually probably wasn't a colour that St. Patrick used, although it's attributed to him, there is truth in the idea that, in part of that idea, which was that St. Patrick was a traveller, and even though he never made it to Chicago, I think we can be sure of that, he many Irish people inspired by him made it all around the world, and many of them did end up in Chicago, and St. Patrick's love goes out to them and everyone they meet and everyone in general. So So we need both the study of history and the study of mythology really to understand St Patrick and many other stories. And who knows, we might find future generations might come down here and find that there was an ancient well